there are a mix of reasons why we can look at how we can look at this question. Firstly, when there are documents on issues of citizenship or criminal cases, it's not unusual, even in a Western democracy, for these to be kept confidential. I mean, unless you happen to be living in Washington, where everything seems to get leaked these days. But these are pretty confidential issues, and they're not likely to be made public, even in Canada or Britain or elsewhere. So it's not surprising that we haven't kind of received any indication of what's in those documents. I mean, allegedly, Georgia supplied documents about Saakashvili's wrongdoings whilst he was president of Georgia until 2013. Remember that Saakashvili has a very mixed reception in Georgia. On the one hand, he's seen by his ardent supporters as somebody who cleaned up the country when he ruled it after the Rose Revolution. I mean, Georgia is an easier place to clean up than Ukraine. It's smaller. There's just one oligarch or so. But at the same time, there are others who literally despise him. He's a very polarizing figure. In this sense, he's very similar to Yulia Tymoshenko in Ukraine or Donald Trump in the US. He always believed that he would be returning to Georgia to somehow try to make a grab at retaking power. All the Georgians I've talked to say this is fantasy land, that his political career in Georgia is over. Now, with somebody with such a big ego like Saakashvili, and he has one hell of an ego, the idea that somehow he can now retire and no longer dabble in politics, whether in Georgia or Ukraine, is something that he is probably unwilling to do. But I think, judging from all the Georgians I've talked to and what I've read about Georgia, Saakashvili's time in Georgia, the likelihood that he could come back and maybe take the presidency, or his party could win a majority again in parliament, is unlikely. His party's now split anyway. In Ukraine itself, Saakashvili has mixed reception. He was a bit of, like all populists, by the way. Look at Donald Trump. He talked a lot during his election campaign. He's done nothing in his first 6 months in power. He's not managed to adopt a single piece of legislation, including repealing Obamacare, which failed yesterday. So populists tend to be big on words, big on rhetoric, but very bad when they're in power or in government, because they're unable to implement those very revolutionary and flowery populist policies. So they tend to be good in opposition, but very bad in government. And we saw that with Tymoshenko. She was great as an opposition leader against Yanukovych, far better than Yatsenyuk or Yushchenko. But at the same time, when she was in government in 2005 and in 2007, 2010, she wasn't that great. So Saakashvili's time in Odesa didn't really produce any results. He will, of course, blame that on Poroshenko, but probably the fault can be on both sides. But certainly he didn't have any successors. He probably didn't try to work with locals to try and improve the situation, and went in like a sledgehammer, and of course that failed. There's no question Odesa needs cleaning up. It's always been corrupt, going back to Tsarist Russia, Soviet Union, and contemporary Ukraine. But Saakashvili doesn't have anything to show for it. Because of that, his popularity in Ukraine is extremely low. So the idea that Poroshenko would want to get rid of him because he sees him as a threat is, I think, wrong on two counts. The popularity of Saakashvili's newly formed political party is less than 2%. So it's not really seen as I don't think, as a threat to Poroshenko. But secondly, more importantly, Ukraine legislation would have prevented Saakashvili from either standing for parliament in the parliamentary elections in 2019 or standing for the presidency in the same year, because he hasn't been a Ukrainian citizen for long enough to be able to stand in for politics, for elections. So he wasn't a personal threat in that sense, and his political force wasn't really a threat. The way it looks at the moment, and I'd be surprised if it changes, the main competition that is gearing up for the Ukrainian election campaign is going to be Yulia Tymoshenko and Petro Poroshenko. Those seem to be the main leading candidates and the main two political forces which are competing with each other. Tymoshenko's party is slightly in the lead at the moment, but to be honest, she's in the lead by about 2%, which is not great if you're an opposition party, because you should be really far more ahead of the incumbent party, which is undertaking these unpopular policies. So there's a depressive streak across all Ukrainian political parties at the moment. So Tymoshenko has shed some crocodile tears about how is this possible that Poroshenko got rid of Saakashvili, but in reality she's a very happy bunny that Saakashvili is no longer around, because there's one of the three populist parties has been removed from Ukrainian politics. The other two are still there. The fake populist party, Lyashko's radical party, which is funded by Firtash and the gas lobby. And then you have Yulia Tymoshenko's party. So the removal of Saakashvili is something that Tymoshenko privately will probably be very happy about, although publicly she will use it to hammer Poroshenko, of course. As always in Ukrainian politics, and in politics in that part of the world, everything is very personalized. And I think that they just fell out, and it just became a personal conflict since his time as governor of Odesa. Things got very heated when he was governor of Odesa. There was one occasion where there was a meeting of the government and Saakashvili, and Saakashvili threw a glass of water over the Minister of Interior, Avakov. So I think these things got very heated, and I suspect this is we're trying to look for something deeper when this is probably just personal politics, tinged with the fact that maybe some bona fide criminal documents did come from Georgia. But I don't buy into the fact that Poroshenko somehow was threatened politically by Saakashvili, because the popularity of his political force, Saakashvili's political force, has been around for about a year and a half, and he hasn't got off the ground. 1.8% is nothing. At a time when Ukrainians are under pressure because of, unpopular fiscal and socio-economic policies, such as the raising of utility prices, populist parties like Tymoshenko and Saakashvili should be actually very popular, because they should be feeding off that discontent, but he wasn't. So I don't think it's that. I just think it's more down to personal questions and a kind of a bit of a disappointment about maybe what the Georgians brought to Ukrainian reform process, because not all of them, of course, but at one stage back in 2014, there was something like 15 or 16 Georgians working in the Ukrainian government. It became so funny that the joke was that the government in exile with Yanukovych is in Moscow and the Georgian government in exile is in Kiev. But most of those have now left the Ukrainian government, and their record is mixed. Some had good record, maybe in the prosecutor's office, in the police force, but Saakashvili's record wasn't great. So, what you might have been able to do in Georgia in terms of reform and fighting corruption doesn't mean to say you're going to be good at that in Ukraine. It's a different country, different mentality, and a bigger problem. Far bigger problem, bigger country to deal with. I don't think that some of the reports have said that this is somehow going to negatively impact upon U.S. relations with Ukraine, because Saakashvili was a darling of Washington. Saakashvili was very pro-American, to an extent where he named many streets in Georgia and in Tbilisi after George Bush. So he was very much a product of that sort of Bush-Cheney neocon era. And because they were very strongly supportive of NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. But those days are gone. Those days are long gone. The current mood in Washington is and the current president are very different to Bush Cheney. So I don't think Saakashvili has the star status in Washington that he used to have. And his star status in Europe has always been pretty bad because, wrongly I believe, but the Europeans blame Saakashvili for starting the 2008 war. Obviously, I think this is very, very, very wrong to argue this, but the Europeans basically blame him for provoking the Russians to invade. Saakashvili was trying to take back what is internationally recognized as Georgian territory, so he's blamed for provoking a war with Russia. At least that's the European viewpoint. In reality, the weak European and even American response to Russia's invasion of Georgia gave Putin the green light, thinking that he could also get away with doing the same thing in Crimea. And so the fault of this is a fault of the West in some ways of not imposing tough sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Georgia. And then they woke up to the fact that Putin said to them, well, what's the difference between what I did in Georgia and what I did in the Crimea? He also de facto annexed South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia when Russia recognized their independence from Georgia. So I don't think Saakashvili's international status is as bright as it used to be, particularly with the mess that's politics in Washington these days. But of course, he has some friends there. But I don't think that's going to impact on U.S.-Ukrainian relations to a great degree. The one thing that is worth bringing out here is that it again shows how bad or how non-existent practically is Ukrainian government PR. When the Ukrainian government does something like this, and it's going to become an international news story, or when they ban Odnoklasniki, VKontakte, and these other Russian sites, similar types of things, they need to have a PR strategy in place to deal with what's going to be international rancor about these kind of issues. And they never seem to have. Why that is a major open question. Because they do hire political consultants in Washington and elsewhere who you would think would warn them that if you're going to do something that's going to have international news story, then make sure you have a response in place, and make sure that on the same day that you, for example, remove his citizenship, that you have an op-ed ready to go in some Western newspaper. But they just don't get it, and they just don't understand. I think Ukrainian politicians are still unable to, or don't really understand how the Western media, Western PR, and public opinion work. Even though it's 25 years into independence, they could easily, for example, hire some good Canadian Ukrainian, American Ukrainian PR lobbyists, political consultants who could work on these kind of things for them. And they'd be a lot cheaper than hiring the people from the swamp in Washington. But so that's another area. Where is the Ukrainian response? I'm trying to explain it and analyze it, but there should be an official one as well. There should be op-eds from the Prime Minister, from the President, or from other people. But there aren't. And so if I was to conclude, I would say in a nutshell, there's probably a mixture of maybe some criminal documents have arrived from Georgia, plus personal fallout, which has been taking place since he resigned as governor of Odesa. I don't think this is a political fear of Saakashvili from a political point of view, because he hasn't taken off as a politician in Ukraine. His political movement hasn't taken off. And he wouldn't be able to stand either as a parliamentary candidate or as a presidential candidate in 2019. 2019, and the election campaign will probably begin in the fall, in the autumn, and in the spring of next year for both elections. This is going to be a Tymoshenko versus Poroshenko. Thankfully, the pro-Russian camp's gone, so they're not even probably going to have a presidential candidate. So it's going to be Tymoshenko. There's a lot of lessons here to learn, but certainly you need to be ready to deal with international public opinion and questions. Just compare the Ukrainian pretty weak or non-existent PR response to the amount of overplay the Russians are putting into their information warfare. Literally. They go over the top, of course, which is why there's blowback from France, Germany, US now. But nevertheless, you have two very contrasting information campaigns: the Ukrainian one, which barely exists, and the Russian one, which is also. Thank you.